The war in Ukraine is in its second year. The recently held G20 foreign ministers meet was dominated by discussions on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It highlighted the fractured East-West relations. As Russia seeks to get its first major win in over half a year, Ukraine is clinging on to the eastern city of Bakhmut. The United States, on the other hand, says it will announce new aid to Ukraine consisting mainly of ammunition. What's next in this war? To discuss this, we're joined by Charles A. Kupchan, Senior Fellow Counsel on Foreign Relations and Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Now, Russia is pushing further into Ukraine, the target being the eastern city of Bakhmut, which the Russian forces, they've been trying to capture this city for quite some time now. What's your assessment of Russia's larger goal here?
Well, from what we can gather, the Russians are attempting to push westward to try to move their forces to the borders of Luhansk and Donetsk. These are the two provinces that constitute Donbass. And it looks like for now, Mr. Putin would like to be able to complete Russian control of these two oblasts while also maintaining what we call the land bridge running from Donbass down to Crimea. The Ukrainians are fighting hard to prevent the Russians from moving into these new portions of Donbass. And it looks like they're also preparing their own offensive once they have more weapons from NATO countries to launch their own offensive, probably further to the south, to attempt to push into this area that connects Donbass to Crimea.
Right. Now, as you know, that at the recently held G20 foreign ministers meet, the war in Ukraine dominated discussions. How do you assess the role of the international community here? Brazilian president, in fact, in the latest Lula da Silva too, has renewed a proposal to take part in international mediation.
Well, you know, what I think we're seeing at the G20 meeting is, number one, a world in which East-West rivalry is coming back. We see the liberal democracies of the world forming one bloc, Russia and China forming a second bloc, militarized rivalry mounting between them. But at the same time, much of the rest of the world is not taking sides. And the G20 is a forum where you have a broad range of countries, the advanced industrialized countries, developing countries, China, Russia, and that's part of the reason that no consensus was available. The two big blocs didn't agree. The developing countries at the table are unhappy with this war and its economic blowback effects around the world, inflation, food shortages, high energy prices. And as a consequence, I think the view remains that in the global south, they don't like this war, they want to bring it to an end. But Russia, NATO, Ukraine, at least for now, have vowed to continue the fight.
Right, absolutely. Coming back to Bakhmut now, it's been under constant, intense attacks by Russia. The Ukrainian forces, they've put up a strong resistance. What's your take on Ukraine's defense capabilities at this point in the war?
Well, there's no question that the Russians have numerical superiority. They've got around 320,000 soldiers in eastern Ukraine. Many of them are new recruits that have not been well trained. But the Ukrainians have an advantage when it comes to morale and willpower, when it comes to better battlefield tactics, and also they have the Western democracies behind them. My best guess is that neither side is going to make significant progress on the battlefield during this new fighting season. We'll see the Russians have good days and bad days, the Ukrainians have good days and bad days, but I think toward the second half of 2023, we will see emerge what looks like a military stalemate. And it's at that time that I think a window of opportunity will open to try to negotiate a ceasefire and perhaps a follow-on set of discussions to try to end the war permanently.
Now, the United States has said that it will announce new aid to war-ravaged Ukraine, consisting mainly of ammunition to help it fight against Russia's invasion. Do you think this will prove to be sustainable? Is it time for the West to maybe rethink its strategy?
No, I think right now the strategy of supporting Ukraine militarily and economically is working. The Ukrainian economy has shrunk by about 30%, and as a consequence, Ukraine relies on international institutions like the IMF, as well as Western democracies, to keep its economy afloat. And at the same time, it is using at a very high rate the javelins, the stingers, the artillery shells, the HIMARS rockets that have been provided to them. And as a consequence, they need immediate resupply. And that resupply is not easy because there aren't big stockpiles of these weapons in Europe or the United States. The US and the Europeans are trying to ramp up production, but they are producing at as high a rate as possible. So right now, the new arms will keep the Ukrainian army in pretty good shape, at least able to hold its own. And then the other key piece here is keeping the country afloat economically, and that will take considerable money moving forward.
Right. Just on that note, for more clarity here, we've seen that sanctions haven't been that effective in deterring Russia. What do you think should be the strategy to hold Russia accountable for its actions in Ukraine?
Well, sanctions in some ways have been the weakest element of policy when it comes to delivering results. The economic assistance and military assistance to Ukraine has been successful. Bulking up on NATO's eastern flank has been successful. The Swedes, the Finns are poised to join NATO. But the very significant sanctions that have been placed on the Russian economy have not succeeded in really setting Russia back in a way that is diminishing the war effort. And that's because the Russians have done a pretty good job of redirecting trade. They're selling energy to India, to Turkey, to China. They have new trade routes coming up from the south, Turkey to Georgia, Central Asia. And in many respects, they've compensated for the sanctions. And so I don't think that the West is going to be able to strangle the Russian economy. As a consequence, the best bet for deterring Russia and convincing it not to continue the war is to continue to set it back on the battlefield. And let's be honest, Russia has already suffered a very significant strategic defeat. Its effort to topple the government has failed. Russia has lost several 100,000 troops, either killed or wounded. It's a very high cost to of this war to Russia.
Right, absolutely. Now, coming back to the point that you'd made earlier, so your assessment is that Russia and Ukraine will only be able to get on the negotiating table maybe sometime in the second half of 2023.
That's correct. I think that right now, both sides believe that they can make progress on the battlefield, and as a consequence will continue to fight. Judging from past history, judging from cases of wars that eventually end in some kind of peace, a stalemate is important because both sides feel that they don't have much prospect of further gains on the battlefield, and they say, you know what, let's try to move from the battlefield to the negotiating table. So it's my belief that the U.S. with its NATO allies should begin to prepare a diplomatic game plan now, discuss it with Ukraine over the course of the fighting season, have it ready to go so that by the time that we do get to something that looks more like a stalemate, there is an agreement with Kyiv on a negotiating strategy, and that would enable the parties to then open the door to come to conversations with the Russians.
Right, absolutely. Now, we've also seen that Russia's war has had an impact not just in Ukraine, but beyond its borders as well. Moldova fears that it may be next in line. I guess this brings us back to Russia's larger agenda here.
Well, you know, we know from Putin's statements when this war was beginning a year ago that Moscow would like to roll back the post-Cold War settlement, would like to roll back the enlargement of NATO. That's not going to happen. What Putin might try to do, although he hasn't been very successful in Ukraine, is to reconstitute some portion of the Russian Empire, the former Soviet Union. He's been trying to do that in Ukraine, but it has backfired. He has alienated Ukrainians. He has made it rather irreversible that Ukraine is leaving Russia's fold for good. Might he try to make a run at Moldova? Might he push to integrate Belarus more closely with Russia? Maybe. But so far, this strategy of trying to use territorial conquest to create greater Russia is failing. And I think ultimately this is a war that will be judged by Russians and by the outside world as a strategic failure.
All right. Well, Professor Kupchan, thank you so much for joining us with your insights on this.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Despite the West's continued ambitious efforts to bolster the Ukrainians, there are no signs of an endgame in the war. The Russia-Ukraine conflict seems destined to enter an even more complicated phase in the months ahead. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.